Hi, and welcome back to Football Made Simple. To say that Chelsea have been formidable since Tuchel came in would be an understatement. In his 35 matches, he has averaged 2.17 points per match, if you equate cup wins to 3 points. And at times they have looked close to unbeatable, but no team is unbeatable, and Chelsea have lost 5 matches so far, so I decided to rewatch all of these matches to see what their opponents did differently to get the win. But just 5 matches isn't a big enough sample size, so we've also looked at a few of the matches they've drawn. Without any further ado, let's get into it. And if you enjoyed today's video, you'll love our video sponsor, the OneFootball app. OneFootball is a one-stop app for all football fans, giving you the latest news, stats, match updates, and so much more, all completely customized for your favorite teams and players. And the best part is, you can download OneFootball for absolutely nothing, for Android and iOS through the link in the description below. The first interesting thing to note is the formations opposing teams use against Tuchel. Of the 12 matches looked at, 6 teams have used a back 3 formation to match up to Tuchel's own back 3. Even the league match versus Manchester City, which Chelsea won but lost on XG, saw Pep using a back 3. And perhaps it's less about the back 3 itself, but more of what it allows. But let's first look at how teams had defensive success against Chelsea, with or without the back 3. When Chelsea have the ball deep, defensive compactness is one of their keys. Half-heartedly pressing, perhaps with only the midfielders and the forwards, will present a huge problem, as it creates a lot of room between the lines for the 3 men behind the forward to drop into. So, some teams, like West Brom, took a much more defensive approach in trying to prevent the space between the lines, sitting deep in what was actually a 5-5-0, with the forward dropping into midfield. On the other hand, most of the aforementioned teams opted for a high block, including a higher line to maintain that compactness higher up. But the teams who have done well against the Blues rarely look to win the ball back off the centre-backs, but rather use high blocks so that Chelsea couldn't have easy progression from their own third to the final third. But the region Chelsea have looked a bit more susceptible to when being pressed is the wide region. This is because with the centre being heavily protected, the wide regions and the wing-backs are the easy outlets for Chelsea. And usually Chelsea are able to have good progression down the flanks, as they can easily create wide overloads due to this wide diamond. And if teams are not diligent in their press, Chelsea can usually break this press in 2 ways. Especially when the opponent is using a back 4, if the fullback is drawn to the Chelsea wing-back, this creates a massive space in the half space for a longer ball to free the winger. Different teams dealt with this in different ways. So, for example, Brighton were lined up in a back 5 already, so the wide centre-back will be well positioned to track the runner, somewhat nullifying this. Southampton had a slightly different approach, as they were defending with a back 4. With their fullback having been drawn onto the Chelsea wing-back, when the Chelsea winger made a run, the centre-backs would have a lot of freedom to leave the central regions and track that run, with the rest of the back 4 shifting across to compensate. United also lined up with a back 4, and could have a similar approach at times. But with Maguire in particular lacking foot speed, being dragged out to the wide regions would not be ideal for United. But United's strength was in 2 workmanlike deep pivots with the ability to cover large distances, so we would see Fred and McTominay look to track the runners in these situations, allowing the centre-backs to hold their position. But protecting the centre is another crucial element. Usually when Chelsea are able to work the ball into their midfield pivots, they then have a numerical advantage, as these men are usually comfortable both pushing right up into the front line or dropping into midfield to create a 4 versus 3 in most situations. So, a priority would be being able to deal with the Chelsea pivots whilst covering these half-space men, and pressing the centre-backs was a less important element. So, firstly, cutting out the Chelsea pivots. Brighton had a unique approach in their 5-3-2. Rather than remain central, the wide forwards would pick up the wide centre-backs, and Pascal Gross had a hybrid role. Initially, he would be on a pivot with another midfielder joining him, so that both Chelsea men were cut out. This would still leave a spare midfielder deeper, who'd be able to sweep up and potentially pick up a man between the lines. In addition, by playing a back five, it meant that the Brighton centre-backs themselves were also more than happy to move higher one at a time to track a dropping Chelsea man. Gross could also then press the third centre-back, as he was sure to keep one of the pivots in his cover shadow so the route into him was covered. So now, Brighton could press all three centre-backs whilst covering both pivots and the men in the half spaces. This partially contributed to an excellent defensive performance, with a clean sheet and less than one expected goal against. Southampton lined up in a 4-4-2 and had a different pressing structure. When they were higher up the pitch, their shape would be more of a 4-4-1-1 with a piston pressing mechanism, with one of the front two pressing a centre-back and the other moving deep, depending on the situation. The most important part was to keep one forward deeper on a pivot, so that Southampton had more of a midfield three, allowing them to effectively cut off the route into the pivots, whilst allowing an extra man to stay deep. But when defending deeper, the Southampton shape could become an extremely narrow 4-4-2, with the forwards often looking to cut off the route into the pivots. This would then give Southampton's own midfielders scope to cover the men who were looking to drop deeper into the midfield and cause the overload. Alternatively, to cover these men in the half spaces, their wingers had high work rate, so they could just as easily drop deep to become a wing-back, with the full-back now moving inside. The United model also brings some different elements. In their 4-2-3-1, Greenwood would press, usually alongside Rashford, and Dan James from the right wing would tuck in onto a midfield pivot. So now, alongside Fernandes, both Chelsea pivots were covered. And now crucially, where Chelsea would have easily had a 5 versus 4 high up in the attack, now, Fred and McTominay had more freedom to follow these free movers and to try and reduce their influence. But when the centre is heavily protected, Chelsea usually have another great weapon in the shape of their wide centre-backs. Antonio Rudiger down the left-hand side is particularly aggressive in advancing with the ball into midfield. The general idea is to help further the overload out wide. Or if a defender is drawn to Rudiger, an attacker higher up becomes free. Alternatively, if it's a midfielder who comes across, a more creative midfielder now has space to receive and look for a game-breaking pass. Brighton's approach was perhaps the most proactive, as by having both forwards wide and Gross central, they could look to directly stop Rudiger from advancing high early on. United also looked to stop the progression early, slightly differently, through Dan James. He has good work rate, so after picking up a pivot, if the ball was then played out to Rudiger, he would be able to spring forward to cut off Rudiger's route into the midfield. But one of the most consistent patterns against these teams is not letting Rudiger's progression destabilize their shape too much. So for example, with Brighton, when Rudiger got past the forwards, the fact that they had a 3-man midfield meant that it could be a wide central midfielder who would move across to cover the centre-back. This would allow the wing-back to still be covered, while still maintaining a man-to-man situation in the midfield. And again, the back five meant that the dropping men could be covered. But alternatively, other teams had success by not really taking the bait when Rudiger advances into the midfield. He may get into these dangerous situations, but as discussed, his main goal is to draw a man to free up the more creative Chelsea players. However, if teams sat off of him and gave him this space, Rudiger couldn't really pick out an eye of the needle pass. So not engaging at all can lead to success. But what are some offensive tactics that brought some joy against Chelsea? Chelsea generally press with the front two, with one of the original front three dropping into the midfield instead. So against back twos, Chelsea would be able to press quite easily. So most of the teams mentioned used a back three, whether this is three centre backs like with the Brighton, a defensive midfielder dropping in, like we saw with Porto and Real Madrid, or a fullback remaining deeper. And this back three is usually quite widespread to make them harder to pick up. But a common theme is that with Chelsea guarding the centre so well, the wide regions are where the damage could be caused. This ideally happened when teams had two men wide, and this could drag both the wingback and the wide centre back out of position, creating space in this channel. And we saw some teams make the run into the space using their forward, whilst others had an attacking midfielder who could do the same. But a consistent area where teams had success against Chelsea is in the transition. Chelsea tends to attack with both wingbacks, and the pivots will naturally drift higher when on the ball. As a result, often opposition teams can get men in behind the pivots to receive the ball and be running at the back three. Subsequently, the areas behind the wingbacks also tend to be vacated, and runners can make them move into the space. Of course, Chelsea are a tough nut to crack, and these are just a few of the areas where teams could potentially have more success. But what potential areas of weakness have you noticed in the Blues? Drop it down below.
A special shout out to everyone who's been able to support Football Made Simple on Patreon so far. If you want to help the channel, I'd love it if you considered supporting on patreon.com/footballmadesimple, and you'll get perks like early access to videos, exclusive content, and so much more.
And I'd like to give a big thanks to all my patrons who voted for this video in particular. And a big shout out to my latest Ultra patrons, including Igor Milijevic and Yusuf Hali McFlurry.
But that's all for today, and remember, keep it simple.